We're going to jump straight in to Alison's talk this afternoon, rather, where Alison is going to be talking about NZ's Dirty Dozen. Hi, Alison.
Hi, everyone. Before I put on my presentation, I'm just going to talk very briefly about myself and my own story. I started being an environmental activist in the 1980s, but it even began before then with my 4 children, and that really had an effect on me, because I wanted to know what's the best thing for, as many a mother wants to do, what's the best thing for my kids. And so that's where I started my journey. And we started the Toxins Action Group, I think it was 1987, in Wainuiomata near Wellington. And then it sort of spread from there. In 1994, Sue Kidgley, who some of you may know by name, she was an MP for 12 years. She and a group of us co-founded the Safe Food Campaign, and I am co-convenor of the Safe Food Campaign. And we deal with a number of different food issues. And this is a good sequel to what Christine was saying before. The importance of food in our diet, and what the food that we choose to buy as opposed to not buy. And this is something that we have, the power that we have as a consumer to choose to buy a food as opposed to not buy another food. This is really important, and I want to stress this above all else. So the Safe Food Campaign tries to bring awareness about a number of different issues, so that you as a consumer, when you go out and buy food, can make a more informed choice. Basically, we promote organic growing, choosing organic food, even better growing your own. But we've dealt in the past with pesticides, with genetic modification, with fluoridation, with additives, and a whole irradiation, so a whole host of issues relating to food. I want to explain a little bit briefly my own background in pesticides. I ended up specialising in it. I have a diploma in public health and a master in public health. I did a thesis basically specialising in pesticides. But I want to make the remark that the politics of whether I'm dealing with pesticides or, dare I say, fluoridation or genetic engineering or additives, whatever it is, tends to be much the same. And it's a matter of trying to effect change step by step. And we've been given lots of good advice over the last couple of days. And in particular, I want to commend to everybody to look at the recording of yesterday's recording, Guide to Organic Living, in the cost of living crisis that we have, because there were lots of good ideas there, and I haven't got time properly to deal with, but organic food is too expensive. And just refer you to the recording when it's available, that became available, that was recorded yesterday. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing. Now, why isn't that? outlined in blue and green. You can see my screen, right?
Yes, Alison, we can see your screen.
Great. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to talk about New Zealand's Dirty Dozen. And first of all, what is this Dirty Dozen? And then pesticides in food are okay, aren't they? So I will talk briefly about some of the problems with pesticide regulations. But I know there are some people in our Zoom session who are very familiar with that. So if I go quickly over it and you want to stop to ask me questions about it, do so. So after each section, I'll pause if you want me to, just to deal with any questions about pesticide regulations, for example. And then I'll go on to describe some evidence of how we and the planet are loaded with children, why children are loaded with pollutants, and why children in particular are at risk. And do pesticides in food really matter? And this is the average person who shops at the supermarket assumes that they're safe. And so they don't feel uncomfortable enough to change what they're doing. And lastly, I should deal with the topic of which foods have more pesticide residues. So I'm just going to talk briefly, very briefly, about New Zealand's Dirty Dozen. It's research that I've done about 5 times over several years, and it's very arduous work. It takes a lot of time, and we don't have we don't have regular pesticide analyses done very often by the government. It's quite expensive. So I have to rely on data that is pretty insufficient, especially compared to America, for example, where the environmental group puts out, the Environmental Working Group, EWG, puts out the US Dirty Dozen every year. They just have it's a much bigger country. They have so many more pesticide analyses than we do in New Zealand. And I will describe in greater detail the how I do this analysis. So pesticide residues are safe, aren't they? According to our Ministry for the Primary Industries, which controls this aspect in New Zealand, residues below the ADI or the acceptable daily intake are assumed to be safe. The dose makes the poison, and the risk assessment weighs up risks and benefits, and it's essentially a subjective process, in spite of the fact that they try to dress it up as science and rigorous and objective. But the more you get into science, the more you discover how subjective it essentially is. And we have this legacy that how well something works, a pesticide, for example, is more important than mostly unknown effects on health and the environment. So some pesticides were registered before they did various tests. And what are the problems? So because admittedly, this is pretty dated, but it's still current for a lot of pesticides, that a lot of pesticides just don't have enough data according to the regulation. And these are keep on being used in spite of known risks. For example, more than 30 carcinogens or something that is in the diet is likely to be to cause cancer, or endocrine, more than 22 endocrine disruptors are found in food. And what are endocrine disruptors? These are chemicals that well, it's the bane of our civilization, really, because even minute amounts can cause problems, hormonal problems. It has an effect on the hormones in the human body. And it's one of the most overlooked aspects of pesticide residues and various plastics like bisphenol A that are around. The testing of pesticide is done on one pesticide at a time, not mixtures, and only active ingredients are tested for chronic tests, not the full formulation, which include various inerts and contaminants. I mean, in the past, at least, lead used to be one of the inerts. Yeah, so some health effects are not yet assessed: immune system, cognitive, behavioral, and neurological effects, including endocrine disruption. Now, the States and Europe have a list of potential endocrine disruption chemicals. We don't have this in New Zealand. This is not acknowledged in New Zealand legislation. So the onus is on our Environmental Protection Agency to prove harm before a pesticide is withdrawn. The reactionary principle is followed rather than the precautionary principle. The EPA assessment program is painfully slow. And I'll draw your attention to the case of chlorpyrifos, an insecticide. It's been sitting on the reassessment list since 2020, but there's no time limit on it. No, nothing. All right, so I'll talk briefly about some of the environmental pesticide, the environmental impacts of pesticides. 95 to 98% go off target. And this is well documented. Even the proponents of industrial agriculture, and there are many in the government regulatory authorities, admit that environmental damage is caused by pesticides. And that's on bees, frogs, fish, insects, birds, reptiles, soil, plants, air pollution, water pollution, and in cold, because the warm air descends and deposits all of the nasty things that have been applied kilometers away, sometimes thousands of kilometers away, onto the cold areas of the earth. And the fact is that we are living in a toxic age. We're surrounded not only by pesticides, but a number of different things. And the emerging pollutant these days is plastic and packaging, what we call the PFAS, or forever, that the chemicals that last forever. And so think of that when you tuck into a box of pizza, for example, that has certain chemicals in it which are bad for your health. Now, at this point, are there any questions about pesticide regulations, or shall I continue on? I'll continue on. So if we get exposed enough to pollutants, it's going to eventually affect our health, especially if we happen to get an infection at the same time. We are loaded with pollutants. The newborn body burden is the greatest. And so many of these are toxic to the brain and nervous system, and so many cause birth defects and abnormal development in animal tests. Breast milk has so many chemicals in it. With glyphosate at 1,600 times drinking water standard, these tend to be US figures, these. Not that I would ever suggest giving up breast milk. I suggest cleaning up what you eat and the environment, because breast milk is too valuable not to have. Even in New Zealand, we haven't done that many tests, but even in New Zealand, we've found a few tests where, for example, dioxin-like compounds in 6-month-old babies exceed those of mothers. So as the Ministry for the Environment labelled it in 2001, an insufficient margin of safety. So the child cops most of it. And Gilles-Éric Serralini, who has already been mentioned in previous session, he's got the quote, and he's done quite a lot of, he's regarded as one of European experts on genetic engineering, by the way. He came out to New Zealand a few years ago. He did an experiment on Roundup, which showed that it was had bad effects on the rats. He says, our children's bodies have become garbage cans. He did quite a few years in the States, so hence the American terminology of garbage. Every day I cry because of those diseases simply caused by the environment. More people have died because of chemicals than during World War II. And children are at risk because they eat more in proportion to their body weight than other age groups. They are less able to metabolize certain chemicals, for example, organophosphates, which are a type of insecticide. And newborns are up to 164 times more sensitive to chlorpyrifos than adults. It depends a lot, and adults can be sensitive too, especially if they're pregnant women. Chlorpyrifos, I mentioned before, and I will mention in more detail, is an insecticide used in New Zealand quite plentifully. Exposure, even in minute amounts, can lead to serious disease later, and there is quite a lot of research on that. And this is where I want to talk about chlorpyrifos in particular, which is a very known danger. And I know that some of you have mentioned glyphosate and Roundup and the dangers of that. And I would echo those, but even worse, in my opinion, is chlorpyrifos. We presented a petition on this in February this year to Grant Robertson as our local MP. And it's found in a number of different food in New Zealand. And it's very well established. Prenatal exposure alters children's brain structure. Children exposed in a womb are more likely to have cognitive impairment at least 11 years after birth, and the research is ongoing on that. In particular, I want to draw your attention to a New Zealand study that was published last year that found that higher levels of this insecticide are in New Zealand school kids' bodies than overseas. They analyze their urine, and it's very persistent in the environment. So it couldn't get much worse news than that. If you'd like to find out more about that, you can go to our website and check the chlorpyrifos article and submission with all the references that we have made to Parliament. So why do pesticides in food matter? Children get more pesticides from food than from other sources. And this is very well established in the research. Intervention studies show a dramatic downturn in pesticides, especially in children. So what are intervention studies? Intervention studies are where sometimes children, sometimes families have had their urine sampled, usually for organophosphates, because that's metabolites are easy to analyze, or the breakdown products. And then they give them organic food for a certain length of time. It could be 5 days, 7 days, or even 14 days in some of them. and they measure them again, and they see what decreases result of certain pesticides. And the New Zealand study that I mentioned before of 501 school-age children confirms that the diet is the most important source of pesticides. Is a graph from one of the intervention studies, and this was done in 2006, American, where they got children who were not eating an organic diet, subjected them to tests, and then gave them some organic food, especially fruit and vegetables, and then they stopped it and measured their levels in urine again, and that's what they found. So they found that during the organic phase, the metabolites went down remarkably. So we know that diet, what you eat, really makes a difference to your body. It's not just the workers on farms who are exposed, but even more important than that is what we are feeding our children. Here's another one. Both of these graphs measure TCPY, which is one of the metabolites from chlorpyrifos that I mentioned before. And you can see that the column on the right has the exposure of children, and compare that to adults, the much lower. This isn't as stark as some differences I've seen with some other insecticides and pesticides, but it shows you that what can be done when somebody becomes organic, when people eat organic food. It makes a big difference for children. So if there's one lesson I want you to take away with you today, it's that the importance of every bit of organic food that you eat. I think we'll skip that for now and perhaps come back to it. So finally, I want to talk about New Zealand's Dirty Dozen, food with more pesticides. And this is the methodology which I've used in the past. And the figures I'm going to present first are from my analysis that's done in 2013. And it's true that I haven't done a complete analysis since then. However, I can present generalizations from all the Dirty Dozen analyses that I have done. And also the fact that as I mentioned before, the pesticide analyses carried out by the government, and there are two main sources that I use, are inadequate and patchy. So the food residue surveillance programs, for example, only cover a certain number of pesticides, a certain number of products each year, and then the next year they'll cover a certain number of other products. The aim of these surveillance programs is to find out whether the growers are applying more than they should, rather than the safety of our food supply. And what I've done, which is in contrast to the EWG, the American Dirty Dozen, is I've used very objective measures. So I've ranked the foods by the number of pesticides in all samples and the percentage with pesticides detected. And this has been made difficult with recent results from MPI because they haven't always put the figures in that I want to be able to draw my conclusions. So I have to write especially to them. And that's all going to take time. So I've combined wheat, usually with total diet surveys. They have 8 of each sample. which is not very adequate to test the safety of our food supply, but that's what they do. So I've combined the number of data with wheat, and that produces a more robust figure. So here's the dirty dozen in 2013. I'll just present this fairly briefly with the number of pesticides and the percentage of with pesticides. So grapes, top of the list. Most of the grapes we buy in New Zealand supermarkets tend to be imported anyway, unless you buy them from your farmer's market in season. So avoid grapes. Celery has been traditionally at the top of the dirty dozen list, and it still is. One could say that things that are not exported tend to be higher in residues. Bok choy and pak choy, leafy greens, nectarines, oranges, strawberries, spring onion, lemons. Now, these last two were a surprise to me at the time because they had not analysed spring onions and lemons before, and mushrooms they also did. And I grew up in Lower Hutt, and I was really surprised to see the pesticide residues in lemons, because everybody in Lower Hutt knows somebody who has a lemon tree if you don't have one yourself. So it's easy enough to get lemons if you live in Lower Hutt and know the right people. So I was really surprised to see the pesticides on lemons. Wheat, so bread and all products. This is high because of the fact that a number of insecticides are applied post-harvest to the wheat in storage. This happens in New Zealand and Australia, but it does not happen in other countries. So a quick way to reduce, well, not a quick way, but a good way to reduce the pesticide residues in our wheat would be to bring in cold storage, for example, instead of spraying with insecticides in a silo. But it's high in New Zealand compared to overseas. Cucumber, pears, and broccoli. So you may not remember all of this, and this is on our website. But here's an up-to-date, so this is up to 2019, pesticides in strawberries. So these are all the pesticides that were found in all the samples. And so strawberries are very heavily sprayed. They always are. And another one that's always heavily sprayed are tomatoes. So this is up to date, and you can see a very long list of pesticides there. And I would, in particular, when we have, when tomatoes aren't in season in New Zealand, please avoid buying Australian ones, because from as far as I can gather, they're even worse. So in the Total Diet Survey that was published in 2016, these had more pesticides, but I want to give you this image, and I want to talk about, in general, what sorts of things are more likely to be heavily sprayed, because as I've tried to explain, it does depend a lot on what the government chooses to analyse that particular year and what it doesn't analyse. So fruit, generally speaking, and that's a broad category. Interestingly, since the 80s, or especially the 90s, since the 90s, apples have not been on that. And I think it's because of the fact that we export apples in our export markets. New Zealand is an export-driven country, and our export markets demand that we lower the pesticide residues in your apples, or we won't buy from you. So after that, that was Sainsbury's in the UK originally in the early 90s. After that, apple export growers instituted a program of only spraying where the need arose and not calendar spraying, which was true in the past. That doesn't mean to say that non-organic apples are free of pesticides. Unfortunately, they tend to have a lot of fungicides in them, which are not desirable. So basically, apart from fruit, we have salad vegetables, tomatoes, cucumber, lettuce, celery, leafy greens, including spring onions, spinach, bok choy, pak choy, and that could include broccoli, and bread and anything containing non-organic flour. And some people have already mentioned why are so many people suffering from celiac disease or sensitivity to celiac. And I personally believe it's a combination of factors. Some people are all right with organic flour. Other people can't survive on it, but there are a suspect number of additives as well that are sometimes added to commercial bread. That's one factor. Another factor is, which have been well known that people react to. Another factor is the way the bread is fermented. A traditional bread is fermented at least twice, but with the Chorley whatever method that tends to be used in commercial bakeries these days, their fermentation cycle is shortened. And this means that not so many nutrients get into your body, basically, and so it's not so easily digested. I mean, we could discuss this more at length. But anyway, I want to ask you, what can we do?
Alison,
yep.
before you go into this slide, can we ask a question? Because Saul Morgan's asking, is there any research to show the impact of the different pesticides on human health? So the impacts of each pesticide. Is there any research to show?
Yes, I've done a lot of exploration about that concerning chlorpyrifos, and it's bad news, basically. The typical danger time is when a woman is pregnant with a child, and if that mother eats chlorpyrifos in food, that's going to go into her baby. And that can have, it depends on the window when the mother eats it, but it can have all manner of effects. So there is a lot of research on the dangers of particular pesticides. There's a lot of research on glyphosate or Roundup. There's more and more being produced every day. There's a lot of research that pesticides in general produce more cancer. I mean, that it's an amazing amount of research that has been done. And if you want to chase up the research yourself, you can go into Google Scholar and just type in pesticides and cancer, for example, and you'll find a vast array. Or pesticides and endocrine disruption. I want to commend a certain book that was like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring for me, called Our Stolen Future. And this had a really a marked impact on me because it told the story about endocrine disruption, how it's affecting wildlife and affecting humans. There isn't so much evidence on humans, but there is plenty of evidence on wildlife and the environment and laboratory animals concerning endocrine disruption. Infertility in particular is one of the effects, and it's well known that infertility has fallen globally. There are a few videos on YouTube about the effects of endocrine disruption on human health, but especially bisphenol A, which is a component of plastic.
BPA? BPA?
Bisphenol A. Yeah. Any other questions before I go to the conclusions?
Christine's asking, what are your thoughts on the effects of 1080?
Bad news. Most of it goes off target, and it has an effect on insects, apart from animals that happen to be caught in it. It's a poison. It throws out the balance of the ecosystem. I mean, there are various arguments about this trapping as opposed to aerial drops. There are humane traps, apparently, that you can get, and these should be utilised much, much more rather than reaching first out to 1080. And I know that 1080 is a contentious topic because some people, even the Green Party, have become resigned to the fact that, yeah, we need the 1080 to control our undesirable mammals that have been introduced into New Zealand, such as possums. But as with anything, I have heard of a useful biodynamic preparation with possums, but most people laugh at that and don't want to have anything to do with it. But I believe there are solutions. It just needs a will.
That's the topic of another webinar completely, isn't it?
That's right.
Thanks.
Any further questions?
No, I think that's it. That's it from the chat. Thanks.
Yeah, so go organic, the obvious choice for your health and the environment. And if you buy non-organic food, and unfortunately, a lot of the people I know just go to the supermarket and buy food because it's easy, it's convenient. At the very least, if you can persuade them to avoid the dirty dozen and imported produce particularly, it's easy. If you're going to buy bananas, at least buy organic and fair trade ones. It's easy to get that in New Zealand now. Anything that you can peel is going to have fewer pesticide residues. Anything that you don't peel or can't peel, such as strawberries, is going to have more pesticide residues. Some pesticides go right through. You can wash some off. You can, if you buy some non-organic produce, you can soak it in a mixture of vinegar and water, 1 part vinegar to 3 parts water, and then rinse it afterwards. And that reduces some pesticides, the acidic ones, but some go right through. Eat in season, buy local, and share what you know with the others. And I'd like to finish with 2 quotes. Someday we shall look back on this dark era of agriculture and shake our heads. How could we have ever believed that it was a good idea to grow our food with poisons? And one of the other speakers has alluded to this attitude. I think it was Noel, that this time that we use toxins on our food to grow our food is going to be an anomaly in the future. And lastly, every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. Okay, so I come back to any further questions, discussions, because I raced through.
I've got Anna asking, in relation to you talking about washing off pesticides, like which produce do you think are okay for washing off pesticides?
Well, if you buy non-organic fruit, it's always worthwhile washing what you can, and vegetables for that matter, especially, so as I've outlined, fruit generally, and vegetables, especially salad greens and leafy greens. It's really worthwhile to wash what you can, and peel if you can. I mean, in the case of celery, for example, there are unfortunately some pesticides that go right through, and there's a metabolite that's formed from mancozeb, which is basically increases on exposure to heat. So think of that next time you put your non-organic celery into your soup. Yeah, so some go right through, unfortunately. So it's always better to grow it yourself and to buy organic where you can. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, it's worthwhile to listen to the recording yesterday of how you can get organic food more cheaply. I speak from experience as a widow with 4 young children, and I didn't have much money. But because my motivation was high, because I knew a lot, because I know a lot about pesticides in food, I still kept buying organic food, even though I didn't have much money. And I did this through a number of ways. There are more ways now than there used to be. But one of these was forming a co-op and splitting up some oranges or mandarins, for example, and joining the, before Common Sense became Common Sense in Wellington, it was a co-op, which I've joined. That was at Te Aro originally, and then they became a shop in Upper Willow Street, and then where they are, eventually where they are today. So it is possible, but it depends on what you know and your motivation. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely. Can I just, there's a comment here.
Right.
Oh, go on, Stefan, you go.
I'm sorry, I'm cutting out. Stephanie, I'd like to add something. Earlier, Alison, you mentioned the fact that they're just testing food for single pesticides. There was an Italian study that included chlorpyrifos, which is not chlorpyrifos, sorry, a fungicide that had always in a celery, with some other commonly used pesticides, and it found that the particular fungicide accentuated the toxicity of the other pesticides. So I would also like to mention that Alison's work on the Dirty Dozen. There was a time when I was able to assist in looking at the Ministry of Primary Industries, New Zealand Food Safety Authority's data, which they were twisting and spinning so that it would look like there was weren't many vegetables with problems, but they exaggerated the testing, and when we analysed it, we found that I think it was a majority of vegetables that we might get at the supermarket or fruits that they were testing actually did have some pesticides in them. It's that thus that they extended that by including a whole range of chemicals in the multi-residue test that would never be used on those. And then they would multiply that out and say there was thousands of tests, only say 6% or something had any residues, which was definitely the case. The important thing for a consumer is what vegetables actually have residues. what I would make a little plea to people on the call is that I haven't been able to help Alison as I once did, but would there be people that could join in and helping her analyse that very data? The data, the raw data is publicly available, but it's how it's presented makes it very, very difficult to, you just have to, it's a time thing. You have to spend a fair bit of time on it. And I'd love to see more people join, say, Food Campaign with Alison and put their hand up to give her assistance, and that we'd have more up-to-date data.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that, Stefan.
Hey, Alison, we could put some comms out around that through the organic channels if you need some volunteers to help with you. We could.
Yeah, that would be really great. Thank you.
For that. I know Stefan just touched on this briefly, but there's a question here that says, do you know the effects of fumigating organic produce like bananas when they are imported due to biosecurity regulations?
Yeah, I have looked into this, and as far as I can gather, there are no residues left of the fumigant that they use, as far as I've been able to gather. However, it's more to do with the growing conditions. I mean, chlorpyrifos, which is the nasty insecticide that I talked about before, even worse than glyphosate or Roundup, has been found in bananas. And the other, another little fact that just to motivate you to go fully organic bananas at least, because bananas are the most popular fruit in New Zealand, that there's no way to that's established, but the bananas, once when they're growing, I heard this as a rumor at one stage, but I haven't been able to verify it. The average life of the person working in the conventional banana plantation is about 6 months, because then they get too sick because of their exposure to pesticides. And also the fact, just pushing the fair trade angle, the growers don't get much money. And so in the case of bananas, they're not likely to make the dirty dozen because of their peel, but it makes growers' life much better and workers' life much better if you buy from your supermarket, buy the organic and fair trade bananas.
Thank you, Alison. Can I just say as well, Alison's website's got it's a really rich resource of information. So if you go to, I've put the web address in the chat, it's safefood.org.nz. There's a great page I'm looking at now, which is about additives to avoid as well. So there's just a great resource there that Alison's put together. I highly recommend you go and have a look at their website, and I'll post it on our socials as well afterwards so you can see.
Thank you.
So unless there's any more questions, we might just end the session there. Any more questions? Thank you, Alison, so much for sharing your knowledge. Really appreciate it. Let's work on trying to find you some volunteers so you can continue this work.
Yeah, that would be great.
And thank you for everyone who participated.
And it's good to see some familiar faces and names. Sol.
Yeah. Hey, thank you for your mahi, Alison. She's been doing this a long time. So yeah, awesome. You're amazing.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks for everyone who showed up today. There's been some people that have been on the chat the whole day, like me. Woohoo, the marathon.
Yeah, thank you, Lou, for your awesome it works. I love how you've added all the links in and stuff. That's great. Awesome.
Thanks. Until next year, happy Organic Week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really great to have these Zoom seminars, I must say. Yeah.
Yeah, let's keep charging on, people.
Yeah, well, if you follow the Organics Aotearoa, because that's my other work, I work for Organics Aotearoa. If you follow their pages, we're running monthly webinars called Lunch and Learns. So we've had a couple already. So I'll be back onto those as of next month. So feel free to come and follow along. Organics Aotearoa New Zealand, or ONs for short. So we are the organics and the official voice of the organic sector in New Zealand.
Awesome.
what's the Satori? I could possibly help. Oh, there you go. We've got a volunteer already, Alison.
Oh,
I will capture that information, Satori, and I'll send it to Alison directly by email. So I've got your email address there.
right. Very good, Satori. So do we call you Rachel or Satori?
You can unmute if you want, Satori. Oh, you don't have to. It's fine. We'll. I'll send her your details.
Yep. No, that'd be great.
It is Rachel, but anyway.
It is Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay. Well, that knows I've been here since 9:30, so I'm gonna end the chat and go and just have a lay down, I think.
Long day. Yeah. But it's good to see familiar names and faces. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you for this opportunity, Owens and Lou in particular, for bringing us together to reinforce each other.
Yep. Absolutely.
And to also to enlighten, to motivate people to change to the better.
Mindset. Change the mindset.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Hey,
Tim.
give us a call, Stefan.
Will do. Cheers.
Thanks, guys. See
Thank
ya.
you.
Thanks, Cole.
Enjoy the rest of your
Bye-bye.
Saturday and weekend.
Bye.